Well, by all accounts, the letter that Paul writes to the Romans has what we might call a unique position among all of Paul's epistles, particularly the seven that scholars know Paul wrote. If you look at the letter, it's very clear that Paul was not the founder of the church in Rome, and no one really knows who founded the church in Rome. And it's very clear when you read the letter that Paul had never even visited this church. So this letter is a little bit different from 1 Corinthians, from 1 Thessalonians, from Galatians, Philippians, and other letters that Paul wrote. But even throughout history, the interpretation of the letter to the Romans has sparked gigantic movements in Christian history. The letter to the Romans changed the life of St. Augustine. It changed the life of the Protestant reformer Martin Luther. In many respects, the way Luther interpreted Paul's letter to the Romans and his letter to the Galatians sparked the Protestant Reformation. In fact, Paul's letter to the Romans had a gigantic impact on John and Charles Wesley and the creation of the Methodist Church and the Methodist movement. The letter itself doesn't appear, at least on the surface, to be directed to any particular problems found in the Roman Church. I mean, this is a letter from Paul that we could say maybe it's not entirely occasional. When it does deal with ethical issues or theological issues, it typically deals with those issues in an abstract manner. What I mean by that is, Paul is not directly responding to some particular problem, issue, or situation in the congregation at Rome. Instead of addressing the needs of Roman Christians, what Paul does is he uses this letter to explain at great length what he believes. He's trying to explain to the Roman Christians his own understanding of the Christian message, of the Christian gospel. And he emphasizes, at least in his particular view, that salvation is for all people, for Gentiles and for Jews equally. And he also points out that this salvation comes to Jews and Gentiles by believing in or having faith in Jesus, apart from doing the works of the Jewish law. Now, one of the mysteries of Paul's letter to the Romans is that his reasons for developing his views at such length to a church he's never visited are never stated. And this is kind of the puzzling thing about this letter. But when we read through it, if you read in between the lines, we may be able to infer some of the reasons why he felt the need to write this letter in the letter itself. And so this is another situation where in order to understand what Paul is doing, we have to look at the letter and reconstruct the situation as best as we can. So in this letter, Paul indicates that he's about to travel to Jerusalem, and he's concerned about his reception among Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. That is, Jewish followers of Jesus. It looks like if you read chapter 15 in Paul's letter to the Romans, verses 25 through 31, that some Jewish followers of Jesus in Jerusalem were suspicious of Paul preaching that you could become a follower of Jesus and be saved without having to do the works of the Jewish law. In other words, Paul was preaching a law-free gospel. He may have been developing his views about the relationship of Jews and Gentiles in Christ as a kind of trial run for his trip. I mean, we don't really know. But he also indicates that he wants to start a mission to the West and suggests that he wants to go to Spain and spread the gospel, the message of Jesus, and that he wants to use the Roman Church as a base for his operations. He says this in chapter 1, verses 10 through 15. So if we're trying to reconstruct what's going on here, given all the misperceptions that some people are having about Paul, it looks like Paul feels compelled to write to the Roman church and explain his side of things. In fact, he may be using this letter, we call the letter to the Romans, to assure his readers and his hearers that what he's doing is right and that they should support his missionary efforts. So this is almost a letter in which Paul is kind of apologizing, defending, in other words, himself and his mission and his understanding of Jesus and his understanding of the gospel. Now, whatever the precise reason is for the letter, it's clear, looking at the letter, that Romans provides what is the most systematic and most thorough exposition of Paul's understanding of God's work of salvation through Jesus. And this is why throughout church history, this letter is talked about, this letter of Paul's is talked about more than any of the other letters. And this is probably why the letter has had such a major impact on people like St. Augustine, John Wesley, Martin Luther, etc., and continues to have an impact on people down to this day. In fact, among scholars, this is certainly the most studied letter of Paul's. We've already seen, talking about 1 Corinthians and even occasionally talking about 1 Thessalonians, we've already seen some of the basic features of Paul's understanding of the importance of Jesus as the way to salvation. But in Romans, what we get is we find the clearest development, the most mature development of all of Paul's theological insight and reflections. So if you were to start with 1 Thessalonians as Paul's earliest letter, written sometime around the year 50, by the end of the decade between 50 and 60, you get the letter to the Romans. So 1 Thessalonians is sort of the least mature version of Paul's thinking. Romans is the most thought out, mature version of his thinking. If we were to closely read Romans, doing that indicates that Paul has different ways of conceptualizing how God used Jesus' death to bring salvation to the world and to individuals. What I mean by that is Paul has what scholars call different conceptual models for salvation. The model that Paul most commonly uses, and this is the one that a Protestant reformer like Martin Luther and John Calvin picked up on, but it's not the only one Paul is using. The one he most commonly uses understands salvation in legal judicial terminology. So this is often called the judicial model. And this model imagines salvation to be comparable to a legal procedure in a court, in a courtroom. In this model, God is likened to a cosmic lawgiver. God has given his laws for people to follow, all people, not just Jews, Jews and Gentiles. In this model, God is also the judge who enacts punishment for the violation of these laws. And the way Paul thinks through this is the unfortunate problem for humanity is everyone has broken these laws, God's laws. What I mean by that, or what Paul means by that, is that in one way or another, everyone has committed acts of transgressions, sins against God's law. They've broken the laws, they've sinned against God and God's laws. So as a result, in this model, everyone falls under the judgment of the court. They fall under the penalty, or they're going to pay the price for the penalty for breaking God's laws. And that basic penalty is death. But if you follow this model to its logical conclusion, Jesus is the one individual as God's Son who does not deserve death because he, unlike any other human being, hasn't violated any of God's laws. So his death is not to pay a penalty that he owes, but to pay for the sins of others. Sometimes Christians will call this atonement theory or atonement theology, that Jesus' death is an atonement for your own personal sins. So in this model, God shows that he accepts the payment of this penalty by raising Jesus from the dead. And human beings, Jew and Gentile, can avail themselves of this payment of their debt simply by trusting that God will find Christ's death adequate payment for our sins. The only alternative is that you pay, or we all pay, for our own sins by giving up our own lives. So those who trustingly accept Jesus' death as a payment for their sins, that is, those who have faith or believe in Christ's death, are treated as if they're not guilty in this court. And the reality is, we're all completely guilty, but believing in Jesus is what gets us out of this. And usually the term that's used for this is that people are justified by believing in Jesus. In other words, they're put into a right standing with God. So this kind of becomes the doctrine of justification by grace through faith, apart from the Jewish law. And certainly this was a main tenet of the Protestant Reformation. This is how Martin Luther read this letter and read it over and against Roman Catholicism and what it had been teaching about Paul. So this model is commonly called Paul's, as I just said, doctrine of justification by faith apart from the law, from doing the works of the law. This term, though, justification, in Greek, it comes from the same root as the word rightness, R-I-G-H-T-N-E-S-S. We can't really translate the Greek word for justification into English without causing all kinds of problems. Just to basically explain what this word means in Greek, it refers to the act of God in which God puts someone into a right relationship with God. In other words, what I mean by this is if you are justified, it doesn't mean you're holy all of a sudden. It just means you are in a right relationship with God. And according to this model, the human problem of sin can't be solved by simply keeping every little bit and piece of the Jewish law. In fact, this is what Paul, as a Jew, this is his big revelation about Jesus, is the law is not what puts you in right relationship with God. What puts you in right relationship with God is faith in Jesus. But this was astounding. It still is astounding for Jews today to hear this, because that seems like a very perverted reading of what the Jewish law is supposed to do for you. But in Paul's thinking, both Jews and Gentiles, all of us, have violated God's law in one way or another, even religious Jews who do their best to keep it. For Paul, everybody, every human being stands under the same penalty of death, and therefore, everyone must be saved from death in the same way. This is also, in a sense, how Paul would argue in a very liberal way, egalitarian way, that all people are equal, because they all stand equally condemned under the law. The law then can't bring about salvation because the law is actually what brings condemnation to people. So Paul says that God is righteous and that people can be made right or put into a right relationship with God by believing in his Son. And then Paul launches into the great human drama, the great human dilemma. And what he says about that is humankind is sinful by nature. This is later on where people like St. Augustine in the Roman Catholic Church will get the doctrine of original sin. Whether you're Jewish, whether you're Christian, whether you're pagan, we are all born into sin, so Paul argues. So everyone is under the power of sin. Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 3, verse 9. And because of that, we are then under God's condemnation, and there is no way to escape that. But in chapter 3 of Romans, particularly verses 21 through 26, Paul adds that God has a solution to this problem. What God has done is acted on humanity's behalf by having his son die for them in an act of unmerited favor. So the argument is nobody deserves this. This is an act of God's grace. It's an act of God's love. God's son becomes a sacrifice that atones for sin, and Jesus' own sacrifice is proof that God is a just God and that God is a righteous God and that God has not abandoned humanity. And in this model, the doctrine of justification by grace, the legal or judicial model, Paul sees the notion of justification by faith apart from the law to be taught in the Jewish law itself. In other words, he's kind of saying that Jews have misread, Jews like him even, have misread the meaning of God's law given to Moses. He particularly sees this in the stories of the father of the Jews, a man named Abraham, which he'll talk about at length in Romans chapter 4. He'll also talk about Abraham in his letter to the Galatians. And he points out that if you read the story of the father of the Jews, Abraham, in Genesis chapter 15, Abraham was justified by God on the basis of his faith, not on the basis of keeping the law. So as he points out, if you go back and look at Genesis 15, Abraham is in a right relationship with God because he believed God, not because he obeyed the law and had himself and other male members of his family circumcised. So again, Paul says, we have been misreading the Jewish law. And you can imagine how other Jews might have felt hearing this, because it's essentially saying, we do not understand our own God, nor do we understand our own law. Well, here's the thing. That's only one thing Paul says in this letter. And that's something, the judicial model, the legal model, is something that's often been emphasized by Protestant Christians. There is, though, another model going on simultaneously in this letter. And it's a model that Eastern Orthodox Christians, Greek and Russian Orthodox Christians have often emphasized, as well as Roman Catholic Christians. The reality is, Paul is saying two things at once, but throughout church history, one or the other has been emphasized. And as I'll say later on, this isn't an either-or issue for Paul. It's a both-and issue. And so if you're reading Paul's letter to the Romans and you say, well, wait a minute, I can find the judicial model, but I can also find something else, you're right. You're finding two things, and they're not contradictory for Paul. They work together. So we can see from the letter to the Romans that Paul doesn't always think of salvation in judicial legal terms. Just let me give you a couple of examples here. If you look at what Paul has to say about sin, sin for Paul is more than an act of disobedience to God. It just is. That's one definition of sin for Paul, but it's not the only definition. Sin, Paul says in chapter 5, verse 13, is in the world. It is a force in the world. At chapter 5, verse 21, he says sin is a force that rules over people. He also says that people can serve sin, as if it's a personal force in chapter 6, verse 6. People can be enslaved by it, chapter 6, verse 17. People can die to it, chapter 6, verse 11. And people can be freed from it, chapter 6, verse 18. You can just go and read all of chapters 5 and 6, and you'll see all these different definitions of sin, which tell you it's not just about disobedience to God. So rather than being an act of disobedience, sin is conceived of by Paul in an apocalyptic way. Should not surprise us because the earliest Christians are apocalyptic Jews. Jesus is, so is Paul. What I mean by this is that Paul conceives of sin as a kind of demonic power that is in the world as a force, as a power, trying to enslave people, Jew and Gentile, to do its will. And if you're a good apocalypticist, you do believe in things like angels, demons, you believe in a devil, all that sort of stuff. You believe in evil being in the world. So Paul speaks of death, this whole concept of death, in similar ways. Death is an evil force, opposed to God, opposed to the will of God. And death can enslave God's people. So in Paul's logic, he sometimes conceives of the act of salvation, not in legal terms, but in apocalyptic terms. And we can call this mode of conceptualization Paul's participationist view of salvation. So you have the judicial and the legal, and you also have the participationist view going on simultaneously in this letter. Protestants often emphasize the judicial, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox Christians often emphasize the participationist. So the participationist view contains, at least on the surface, similarities to the judicial. The problem is thought of as sin, it's conceived of as sin. Sin leads to death, and the solution to the human problem is Jesus' own death and resurrection. But the meanings of these terms and the way one model or the other works are entirely different. In the participationist model, sin is a cosmic force. Sin is a cosmic power that enslaves people. Everyone is enslaved to this power, and no one, Jew, Gentile, barbarian, can escape it. But Jesus escaped the power of sin and death. And the evidence for this is, for Paul at least, provided by Jesus' resurrection. In the resurrection, Paul argues Christ defeated the power of death, so he must also have defeated the concomitant power of sin, because the two go hand in hand. In the participationist argument, people can escape the power of sin by participating, that's why it's called participationist, by participating in Jesus' victory over sin and death. And this occurs by followers of Jesus being united with him in his death. The way this happens, and this was very, very true in the ancient church, it's still true down to this day, this all occurs when a person is baptized. When you go through baptism, you are baptized into Christ's death, therefore you start participating in it. Therefore, the logic here is that those who have been baptized into Christ have escaped the nefarious powers of death and nefarious powers, the evil powers of sin, and they're freed for resurrection and eternal life. So the best way of looking at this is to simply go through and compare these two models. But again, both of these are going on simultaneously in Paul's letter to the Romans. Throughout church history, and I can't emphasize this enough, either one side of this coin is emphasized or the other. But the reality is they're both two different sides of the same coin. So if we're going to compare and contrast these two conceptual models of salvation, that is the judicial and the participationist, what we would start out by saying is that in one, the judicial, sin is seen as an act of disobedience. In the other, the participationist, sin is seen as an evil cosmic force, as an evil cosmic power. In the judicial, the human problem, the human predicament, is the penalty of death that comes through violation of God's law, the law given to Moses on Mount Sinai, the Jewish law. In the participationist, the problem is being enslaved to an alien power, a cosmic sinful power. In the judicial, the divine solution is for Jesus to pay the penalty that humans owe, to atone for the sins of human beings. In the participationist, the solution is for Jesus to break the enslaving power of sin and death, to bring about liberation. In the judicial, salvation then comes by means of trusting, having faith in Jesus' death, faith and belief that he has paid the penalty. In the participationist, it comes by participating in Jesus' own victory over sin and death by being united to Jesus' death through the act of baptism. And those are essentially what's going on. You have the judicial and you have the participationist. Paul is not saying one or the other. He is saying both. So it's important to remember in Romans, and this is still an error that a lot of Christians, Catholic, Protestant, etc., Orthodox, make, even down to this day, despite the warnings of scholars. Paul did not see these models as being at odds with one another. Likely what happened back in the first century is still what happens today. People thought Paul was emphasizing one of these over the other, and this is why there were so many misunderstandings of Paul. This is likely why he had to write this letter to a church he had never visited to clear up what he was saying and thinking in all of these other letters that he had written. So what drives people mad with this, though, is that he never explicitly lays out his models or explains their similarities and or differences. Rather, what he does is he takes the models, and they're presupposed throughout this letter, and they're also presupposed throughout all of Paul's other writings. He just assumes you kind of know this, even though he doesn't systematically say, hey, here I'm thinking about judicial models, here I am thinking about participationist models. The models in Romans and in all of his other letters interact closely in Paul's mind. So again, as I say, this is not either or for Paul, this is both and. To give you an example of this, if Paul asks the question, as he does in Romans, why is everyone guilty before God? In chapter 3, verse 23 of Romans, he answers that with the judicial model, saying, because all human beings have sinned through acts of transgression against God. But when the question is asked, why has everyone sinned? He turns around and answers that question with the participationist model in Romans chapter 3, verse 9, in which he says, because all human beings are under the alien power of sin. So right in one chapter, Paul can be judicial and participationist from one sentence to another. When the question is asked, why is everyone under the alien power of sin? He uses both the judicial and participationist model in chapter 5 to answer this question. He says, because the first human being, Adam, committed an act of disobedience, that's judicial, this allowed the power of sin to enter the world. That's participationist. And this goes on and on and on throughout Paul's letter. And not just Romans, but Galatians, and it's there, I think, in the other letters that are the authentic letters of Paul, the 7 letters that are authentic. Well, as Paul himself saw, both of these models have really profound implications for understanding Israel, the Jewish people, and Judaism as a religion. And in modern day scholarship, people have said, look, something that Christian history hasn't paid a lot of attention to in the letter to the Romans are 3 chapters. Romans chapter 9, Romans chapter 10, and Romans chapter 11. It's these 3 chapters in which Paul, as a Jew who is now a follower of Jesus, has to talk about the nature of Israel, the nature of Judaism, and the Jewish people. Remember, he considers himself part of those people. And the reason why this is important for Paul is the participationist and judicial model have implications for all of this because both models insist that it is only by Christ's death and resurrection that God brings salvation. So somebody is going to ask at some point, well, Paul, if that's true, what about your own people, the Jews? What about Jesus' own people, the Jews? What about Judaism? What about the nation of Israel? And Paul is very concerned about this. In fact, if you read Romans 9, 10, and 11, you see this concern. In fact, he just brings it up. What about Israel? And talks about it for 3 chapters. So he needs to deal with the question. And it's a very complex question of whether God has changed the rules. Or, even worse, has God rescinded his original covenant with the Jewish people, with Israel? In those three chapters, Romans 9, 10, and 11, Paul does everything he can to tell followers of Jesus that God has not changed the rules, nor has God changed God's mind. He's not rescinded, in other words, his covenant with Israel. So in Romans 9 through 11, he deals with all of these thorny issues, and he argues that God is faithful and God has not gone back on the promises that were originally made to the Jewish people. And he says this full well knowing that many of his fellow Jews have rejected God by rejecting his son, Jesus. But in these three chapters, he points out that bringing non-Jews into the people of God, this is all part of God's plan. In fact, it's part of the divine plan. And so what he says, and I think this is a very important part of Romans, is that it's precisely because of the non-Jews coming in to the people of God that one day the original people of God will come back, and they too will be saved.